Okay, I get this question all the time. Renters are like, okay, Alia, I requested my rental history from the state. I got it in the mail. What does this mean? What do I do with this information? And just as a disclaimer, I am not a lawyer. I am not a broker. I am not a landlord, but I did start Open Igloo, so renters have shared copies of their rental history with us. I've seen a lot of these. So let's go step by step on what you can expect to see on your rental history and what it means. Okay, first thing, you are going to see your address and apartment number at the top of this rental history. Then you're going to see registration, apartment information, and a bunch of columns. This rental history, a renter sent over to us asking for help reading it. The far left column, it's going to say reg year. That's the year that the landlord registered the apartment with the state. Landlords who have rent-stabilized apartments are required to register the apartments with the state every single year. That registration will appear on the rental history and it will say what the status of the apartment is. So on this rental history, it says RS. That means rent stabilized. It will also say the filing date, so when they submitted the registration. It will also say the tenant. So if you are living in a rent stabilized apartment, you should expect to see your name on the rental history. Next column is the legal regulated rent. This will be a rent number. This is the maximum rent that a landlord is allowed to charge. The next column is the preferential rent column. This is not necessarily always applicable to a rent stabilized apartment. An apartment will have a preferential rent if the landlord chooses to give you a rent number that is better than the legal rent. So let's say the legal rent is $2,000, but the landlord is only charging you $1,800. The preferential rent is $1,800. Then there's going to be a few other columns, one of which is the reasons or difference for the change. Usually this is just a renewal. Sometimes it can be vacancy. Sometimes there can be capital improvements on the apartment. But essentially the landlord has to explain and register, and it will show in this column why the rent changed. And then the last column will show what the dates were for the lease term. Okay, this is something really common that renters will see on their rental history, and beside a year it will say reg not found for subject premises. All that means is that DHCR, the state agency that manages stabilization, could not find a record for that year. That doesn't mean that the apartment is deregulated or not stabilized. All it means is that the landlord didn't file the registration like they were supposed to. And it is very common for landlords to sometimes fall years behind on the required registrations. Another thing that you might see on a rental history is that it says registration exempt. There's a few reasons an apartment may be exempt. One is because it's rent controlled. If it's rent controlled, not rent stabilized, if it's rent controlled, then landlords do not have to register every single year, but it will say RC under the apartment status instead of RS. If you have an RC apartment, you won the lottery. But the other reason, and the most common reason to see registration exempt, is because the apartment has been deregulated. Prior to 2019, landlords could deregulate apartments for a variety of reasons. One, the rent hit a certain amount, so there was a high rent reset cap. I think it was around $2,800. So as soon as the rent surpassed that number, then it automatically became destabilized. An apartment could also be destabilized if it went through a significant amount of renovations when someone moved out. So those are legitimate and legal reasons for an apartment to fall out of stabilization, but that would have had to been before 2019. So the main thing you want to check and confirm when you get your rental history is if the apartment is stabilized, and then you want to look at the legal rent, and you want to make sure that your landlord is not charging you more than the legal rent listed on the rental history. You also want to make sure that nothing looks weird on the rental history, big increases in rents, or if it was destabilized after 2019. Another important thing to note, and DHCR writes this on the rental history, this document merely reports the statements made by the owner in the registrations filed by such owner and does not reflect changes in rents occurring after April 1st of each year. DHCR does not attest to the truthfulness of the owner's statements or the legality of the rents reported in this document. So essentially what they're saying is they do not verify or confirm that anything that the landlord files is actually legit. It's really on the onus of the renter to hold their landlords accountable and make sure that they are registering the appropriate rent. Another important thing to note is that there is a statute of limitations on landlords charging, overcharging, illegally deregulating, and that is 6 years. So that is another reason for you to go request your rental history history ASAP. I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have questions in the comments. Be sure to request your rental history if you haven't already. Tell all of your friends to request their rental history, and then share what you find out in a review on OpenIgloo. It's completely anonymous, so other renters can learn about your building and landlord before they sign a lease.